History is full of powerful generals, massive armies, and legendary battles. But sometimes, the fate of an entire nation depends on one man's patience. In the early 1800s, Europe was trembling under the power of a single ruler. Kingdoms had fallen, empires had collapsed, army after army had been crushed on the battlefield. His name was Napoleon. To many people at the time, Napoleon seemed unstoppable. His armies moved faster, fought harder, and won battles that other commanders thought were impossible. Austria had fallen, Prussia had been defeated. Much of Europe now stood under his influence. And then he made a decision that would change history forever. He decided to invade Russia. In 1812, Napoleon gathered the largest army Europe had ever seen. Nearly 500,000 soldiers marched east across the continent. French troops, Polish cavalry, German units, Italian divisions, all moving together in one massive force. The plan was simple: defeat the Russian army quickly, capture Moscow, and force the Russian emperor to surrender. Most people believed it would work. After all, Napoleon had defeated almost everyone who stood in his way. But Russia had something Napoleon did not fully understand: distance, endurance, and a commander who believed that sometimes the smartest way to win a war is to refuse the battle your enemy wants. That commander was Mikhail Kutuzov. By the time he faced Napoleon, Kutuzov was already a veteran of decades of war. He had fought in brutal campaigns, survived injuries that should have killed him, and spent years studying how armies truly collapse. While other generals chased glory on the battlefield, Kutuzov believed in something different: patience. Instead of rushing into a dramatic confrontation, he allowed the French army to move deeper and deeper into Russia. Every mile forward made the French army weaker. Every day made supplies harder to find. And slowly, the greatest military machine in Europe began to walk into a trap. A trap built not with walls or fortresses, but with distance, time, and the brutal Russian winter. What followed would become one of the most devastating military disasters in history. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers would disappear, cities would burn, armies would freeze, and the man once believed to be invincible would watch his empire begin to crumble. This is the story of the general who defeated Napoleon without chasing glory, the man who survived death twice, and the strategy that saved an empire. Imagine being shot in the head and surviving. Now imagine it happening twice. Most soldiers would consider surviving one such moment a miracle, but the man who would later defeat Napoleon Bonaparte experienced it not once, but 2 times in his life. Many believed fate had chosen him for something extraordinary. Others whispered that he was simply impossible to kill. Long before he became the general who would save Russia, he was just a young boy born into a world that was rapidly changing. Mikhail Kutuzov was born in 1747 in the vast Russian Empire. At that time, Russia was transforming itself into one of the most powerful nations in Europe. Cities were expanding, armies were modernizing, and the empire was growing larger every year. Kutuzov was born into a military family. His father, Ilarion Kutuzov, was a respected general and a brilliant military engineer. He worked on massive construction projects that helped protect the imperial capital of St. Petersburg from floods and enemy threats. Because of this, young Kutuzov grew up surrounded by soldiers, officers, and military thinkers. From a very young age, his life revolved around strategy, discipline, and the realities of war. But there was something different about him. He was incredibly curious. While other young boys dreamed only of glory on the battlefield, Kutuzov loved learning. He studied languages, science, mathematics, and politics. Over time, he became fluent in several languages, including Russian, French, German, Polish, and Turkish. In 18th century Europe, this was a powerful advantage. It meant he could communicate with diplomats, understand foreign commanders, and navigate the complex world of European politics. But knowledge alone does not create a legend. War does. Kutuzov's military education eventually led him to serve under one of the most feared commanders in Russian history, Alexander Suvorov. Suvorov was famous across Europe for his aggressive tactics and lightning-fast campaigns. His philosophy was simple: move fast, surprise the enemy, and attack before they even understand what's happening. Serving under Suvorov was like attending the toughest military academy imaginable. Battles were constant, pressure was intense, and only the strongest officers survived. For the young Kutuzov, these years became the foundation of everything he would later achieve. He learned how armies move, how commanders think, and how chaos on the battlefield can decide the fate of nations. His early campaigns took him across Eastern Europe, especially into the unstable lands of Poland, where political conflicts constantly erupted into violence. But the greatest challenge of his early career came when Russia entered a brutal conflict with one of the most powerful empires in the world, the Ottoman Empire. The wars against the Ottomans were fierce and unpredictable. Cannons roared across the battlefield, smoke filled the air, soldiers fought desperately for survival. And it was during one of these battles that something happened that should have ended Kutuzov's life forever. In 1774, while leading an assault against Ottoman defenses, Kutuzov advanced with his soldiers toward enemy trenches. Suddenly, a musket fired from the Ottoman lines. The bullet struck him directly in the head. For a moment, everything stopped. The young officer collapsed instantly. Soldiers around him believed their commander had been killed. But something unbelievable had happened. The bullet entered near his temple, passed behind his eye, and exited through the other side of his skull without destroying his brain. Against all odds, he survived. Doctors struggled to explain how such a wound had not killed him. Recovery was long and painful, and the injury permanently damaged his vision. For the rest of his life, he would suffer severe headaches from that wound. Most men would have retired after such an injury. Kutuzov did the opposite. He returned to the battlefield. Years later, during another brutal clash with Ottoman forces, fate tested him again. Kutuzov once again led his troops into combat, moving toward enemy lines with the same courage that had defined his career. Then suddenly, another shot rang out. Another bullet struck his head. This time it entered through his cheek and exited near the back of his neck. Once again, the wound should have been fatal. And once again, he survived. News of this unbelievable survival spread quickly through the Russian army. Soldiers began whispering stories about the strange commander who had cheated death not once, but twice in his life. Some believed he was protected by destiny. Others believed God himself had spared him for a greater purpose. Whether it was luck, resilience, or something beyond explanation, one thing became clear. Mikhail Kutuzov was not an ordinary soldier, and the experiences that nearly killed him would shape the calm, patient, and deeply strategic commander he would later become. A commander who would one day face the greatest military genius Europe had ever seen, Napoleon Bonaparte. History is full of brilliant generals, but sometimes the most dangerous moment in a leader's life is not the battlefield, it's politics. And for Mikhail Kutuzov, politics would nearly destroy everything he had built. By the late 1700s, Kutuzov had already survived battles that should have killed him. He had proven himself against the Ottoman Empire and gained the respect of many soldiers across the Russian army. But surviving war was only part of the challenge. The Russian Empire was ruled by powerful personalities, and military careers often depended on royal favor as much as battlefield success. Kutuzov understood this reality very well. Unlike many generals who focused only on fighting, he also learned how to navigate the complicated world of diplomacy and politics. This ability would later become one of his greatest strengths. After recovering from his battlefield wounds, Kutuzov began rebuilding his career. He developed relationships with powerful political figures and military leaders, including Prince Grigory Potemkin, one of the most influential men in Russia at the time. Potemkin was a trusted advisor and close companion of Empress Catherine the Great. Through this connection, Kutuzov began receiving new responsibilities and important military appointments. But Kutuzov was not just a soldier, he was also a thinker. In the 1780s, he even wrote a military treatise discussing tactics and the role of specialized infantry units known as Jaegers. These troops were trained to move quickly, operate independently, and adapt to unpredictable battlefield situations. At the time, these ideas were considered innovative. They showed that Kutuzov was thinking beyond traditional warfare. He was studying how modern battles were evolving. But while Kutuzov was strengthening his reputation inside Russia, something much bigger was happening across Europe. In 1789, the French Revolution exploded. Kings were overthrown, aristocrats fled the country, and the powerful new idea spread across Europe that ordinary people could challenge royal authority. The revolution shocked monarchies across the continent, but it also produced something even more dangerous: a new kind of army. France introduced mass conscription, meaning huge numbers of citizens were drafted into military service. This dramatically increased the size of European armies and changed the scale of warfare forever. And from within this chaos, a young officer began rising through the ranks. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was brilliant, ambitious, and fearless. His rapid victories soon made him the most famous general in Europe. One by one, the traditional powers of Europe began falling before him. Austria, Prussia, Italy, entire kingdoms collapsed under the speed and aggression of Napoleon's campaigns. Across the continent, leaders began asking the same question: who could possibly stop him? In Russia, Kutuzov was watching these developments carefully. He understood that Europe was entering a new era of warfare. Armies were becoming larger, faster, and far more destructive than ever before. But before Kutuzov would face Napoleon directly, he would first experience one of the most humiliating moments of his career, a defeat so devastating that it nearly ended his legacy forever. For years after the disaster of Austerlitz, Europe lived under the shadow of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. His empire stretched across much of the continent. Kingdoms had fallen before him. Powerful armies had been crushed by his strategy and speed. Many leaders believed Napoleon was simply unbeatable. But in 1812, everything began to change, because Napoleon made a decision that would become one of the most dangerous gambles in military history. He decided to invade Russia. At the time, tensions between France and Russia had been growing for years. Political alliances were fragile, trade agreements were breaking down, and both empires were slowly drifting toward conflict. Napoleon believed Russia had betrayed his economic blockade against Britain. Tsar Alexander I believed Napoleon's growing power threatened the balance of Europe. Eventually, diplomacy failed. War became inevitable. Napoleon began assembling the largest army Europe had ever seen. Soldiers arrived from across his vast empire: French troops, Polish cavalry, Italian infantry, German units, and many others. By the summer of 1812, nearly 500,000 soldiers marched east toward Russia. This massive force became known as the Grande Armée. Napoleon believed the campaign would be quick. He expected to defeat the Russian army in one decisive battle and force Tsar Alexander to negotiate peace. But Russia was not like the countries Napoleon had conquered before. It was vast. Its distances were enormous. Its winters were brutal. And most importantly, the Russian army refused to fight the kind of battle Napoleon wanted. At first, Russian commanders began retreating deeper into their own territory. Instead of defending cities aggressively, they slowly pulled back, avoiding a full confrontation. This strategy confused Napoleon. Why weren't the Russians fighting? Why were they giving up land so easily? Inside Russia, however, this retreat created political tension. Many nobles and officers believed the army was surrendering the country without resistance. Public anger began growing.
The Tsar needed a leader who could unite the army and restore confidence, someone respected, someone experienced, someone the soldiers trusted. So in August 1812, Tsar Alexander made a surprising decision. He appointed Mikhail Kutuzov as commander-in-chief of the Russian army. Many people were shocked. Kutuzov was now old, tired, and remembered by some for the humiliation of Austerlitz. But among the soldiers, his reputation was very different. They trusted him. They believed he understood war better than anyone else in Russia. When Kutuzov arrived to take command, the army welcomed him with enormous enthusiasm. Soldiers cheered as he passed through their ranks. For them, this was not just another general. This was a leader who had survived decades of war and somehow always endured. Kutuzov quickly understood the situation. Napoleon's army was powerful, but it was also far from home. The deeper it marched into Russia, the longer its supply lines became. Food would become scarce, horses would weaken, and eventually winter would arrive. Kutuzov believed patience could defeat Napoleon more effectively than reckless battles. But before retreating further, the Russian army decided to make one stand, a massive confrontation that would become one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Napoleonic Wars. The battlefield was near a small village west of Moscow. Its name was Borodino, and what happened there would shock all of Europe.
The Battle of Borodino left the battlefield covered in smoke, fire, and thousands of fallen soldiers. Both armies had fought with incredible brutality. Cannons roared from sunrise to sunset. Infantry charged again and again, and the ground itself seemed to shake under the thunder of war. By the end of the day, nearly 70,000 soldiers had been killed or wounded. It was one of the bloodiest single days of fighting in European history. Napoleon's army technically held the battlefield, but the Russian army had not been destroyed. Kutuzov had managed to keep his forces alive, and for him, that was the real objective. After Borodino, the road to Moscow stood open, the ancient capital of Russia. A city filled with history, culture, and national pride, now stood directly in Napoleon's path. Across Russia, people waited anxiously. Would Kutuzov defend the city? Would the Russian army fight another massive battle to protect it? The answer shocked everyone. Kutuzov made a decision that many believed was unthinkable. He chose to abandon Moscow. To many Russians, this felt like a betrayal. Moscow was not just another city, it was the heart of the nation. Leaving it without a fight seemed unimaginable. But Kutuzov understood something most commanders did not. Cities can be rebuilt. Armies cannot. If he sacrificed his soldiers defending Moscow, Napoleon might destroy the Russian army completely, and if that happened, Russia itself could fall. So Kutuzov ordered a retreat. The Russian army quietly withdrew from the city, leaving Moscow almost empty when Napoleon's forces finally arrived. Napoleon expected triumph. Instead, he found silence. The city was largely deserted. But what happened next would become one of the most mysterious and devastating events of the entire campaign. Fires suddenly began appearing across Moscow. At first, they seemed small. Then they spread rapidly. Strong winds pushed the flames from street to street, building to building. Within hours, massive sections of the city were burning. Napoleon watched in shock as the great capital of Russia turned into an ocean of fire. Historians still debate exactly who started the fires, but the result was catastrophic. Large parts of Moscow were destroyed. Food supplies vanished. Shelter disappeared. And Napoleon's army suddenly found itself trapped inside a ruined city with winter approaching. For weeks, Napoleon waited for Tsar Alexander to negotiate peace, but no message came, no surrender, no agreement. Instead, the Russian army waited patiently outside the city, watching their enemy grow weaker every day. Eventually, Napoleon realized the truth. He could not stay. With winter approaching and supplies running out, the Grande Armée was forced to retreat. and that retreat would become one of the greatest disasters in military history. As French soldiers marched back across the frozen Russian landscape, hunger, exhaustion, and freezing temperatures began destroying the once powerful army. Kutuzov followed carefully, attacking only when the moment was right. Russian forces struck retreating units again and again, turning the withdrawal into chaos. The mighty Grande Armée slowly collapsed. Out of nearly 500,000 soldiers who had marched into Russia, only a small fraction would ever make it back home. Napoleon, the man who had once seemed unstoppable, had been broken, and the quiet, patient strategy of Mikhail Kutuzov played a crucial role in that defeat. He had not destroyed Napoleon with one dramatic battle. Instead, he had done something far more powerful. He had allowed Russia itself, its distance, its people, and its unforgiving winter to defeat the greatest army in Europe. In the end, the man who survived 2 bullets to the head had also survived one of the greatest wars in history, and his legacy would forever be remembered as the commander who helped save Russia from Napoleon.